Hey everyone, my name is Trevor, and today I've got what I think is an interesting one. I spent some time the last few days experimenting a little bit with Avi's GSLB in AWS and wanted to make a video covering everything I learned. So it's going to be a long video. I'm going to create sections. If you have specific things that you want to figure out, I would recommend using the sections, but this is meant to take somebody who has a very basic knowledge of Amazon and a very basic knowledge of Avi and what it is. This is meant to provide all of the information you might need to get some GSLB up and running across a couple of Amazon regions. Let's get started. Today, I've done away with PowerPoint. I'm going to be using a Miro board because I'm cool, okay? I can do awesome whiteboarding on the internet. I don't have to do everything in PowerPoint. I'm a real engineer, all right? So anyway, I'm going to walk you through the solution. I have a diagram that I just want to give you a high level of kind of what GSLB is, how it works, why it's important. Then I'm going to take you through all the steps that I went through the last few days. I'm going to walk through how you set up Avi in Amazon, how you configure your VIPs to get the bones in place for a GSLB service. I'm going to walk you through the Amazon specifics of what you're going to need to get this up and running in your Amazon environment. I'm going to show you some useful DNS troubleshooting tips that I learned during the setup that I think will be useful if you hit any issues in your environments. And then at the very end, I'll just comment on a few ways that, GSLB is a service. And if you know anything about Avi, it's a application services fabric, right? We're providing load balancing, layer 7, layer 4 services, as well as WAF and DNS based services. And so the one way to manage those services is via the Avi controller directly. But, sometimes there are other interesting ways to automate and consume something like GSLB. Great example of this, and what I'll discuss later, is Tanzu Service Mesh. So you can have Avi function as a GSLB for your service mesh. And you can also have Avi integrated directly with your Kubernetes clusters using something called AMKO. That's the agenda. Let's start with the solution. So in my environment, what I'm going to walk you through is a GSLB setup. Now, within the world of Avi, there are some things that have to happen. I'm going to walk you through that. The real important components from a data plane perspective anyway, when it comes to GSLB, GSLB is a way to route a client request to different infrastructures using DNS as a control protocol. So if you already know a little bit about load balancing and regular VIPs, right? TCP/IP is the kind of control protocol for hitting a VIP, but DNS can be used to do things like, for example, have a client resolve to a specific VIP, right? So I have my US East 1 VIP and my US East West VIP, right? And these are different IPs, but maybe I want to have users that are located on the East Coast only be directed towards the West site. And maybe I want East Coast to only be directed towards the East site. Or maybe I would like to just have additional availability. Maybe I don't care which data center the user's routed to, but I just need to be able to protect against a full outage of a site. So that's why you would need GSLB. Generally, this is for active-active or DR type of use cases within environments. And all it really is, if you understand the concepts of VIPs and pools, all GSLB really is an additional layer of DNS on top of that. So that way, when the client goes to your website, to whatever that service is that you're hosting, so maybe www.global.trevor.poc.demoavi.us. That's a really long URL. I would recommend a shorter one. That's the one that I'm using. When a user hits that URL, when you hit a domain name, the first thing you have to do is resolve DNS, right? So the flow of traffic is pretty straightforward. If a client always has a DNS server set, it's usually their ISP or maybe it's their corporate network, right? So that's going to hit their ISP first, saying, "Hey, who owns this domain?" In my environment, and what I'm going to walk you through, since this is about AWS, eventually this domain, the poc.demoavi.us domain, Route 53 is authoritative for that domain, right? So what we got to do to allow Avi to control a domain is effectively delegate a subdomain. So I'm basically pointing all traffic that is a trevor.poc.demoavi.us URL towards Avi. So user types in their URL, they're going to hit Route 53. Via this delegation that I'll walk you through later, Route 53 is going to say, "Hey, actually, I don't know what the A record to give you is for that URL, but you know who does know? These two Avi name servers, which, by the way, the name servers, these are actually virtual services that are configured in Avi. I'll walk you through that as well in a bit. So you just configure a virtual service and you make DNS the protocol, and you do a couple configurations, and now it can own that domain and respond with either IP. So when this user resolves, it's ultimately its DNS request is going to be routed to one of the DNS service engines, and then that service engine is going to respond with one of the A records for the VIP. So it's either going to respond with the East A record or the West A record, effectively doing global server load balancing using DNS as a control protocol. By the way, in my environment, I'm running my app in US East 1 and US West 1. So I've just got this little web app running that we'll do all the testing on. However, these don't have to all be in Amazon. You could have the app living in Amazon and Azure and Google and your on-prem data center at the same time. Avi will support any topology you throw at it. It's one of the benefits of using a multi-cloud and fully agnostic solution like Avi is that we can deploy all of the services in any cloud always, making it so that your strategy changes aren't going to affect your ability to deliver global services. And it's also going to allow you to deliver global services on any infrastructure from public cloud to Kubernetes to your on-prem data centers as well. So that's the high-level solution. Now I think it would be good to walk you through Avi. And so I'm going to show you what I have. And I have two controllers. I have a controller deployed in a US East-West region and a US East region. Again, that's for availability. You're generally going to want to have at least two controller clusters if you're doing GSLB. You can run it on one for like a test environment for sure. But just for availability, remember GSLB, you want to protect yourself against a full site going bye-bye. And so the best way to do that is going to be to have a controller at each site. That way, if this site goes bye-bye, that we can still continue to operate and still continue to serve client requests via the Avi services that are deployed in your other region or data center or whatever your environment is. Now I'm going to walk you through some Avi Side setup, okay? Okay, so I am in an Avi controller in my East Avi controller, actually, is what I'm in right now. You can see I have a couple of virtual services. I have two, right? My environment is very simple. It only has two, but if this is a real world environment, you probably have more than two VIPs. I've got my web app. This is going to be the app that I ultimately end up load balancing to, and I'll show you real quick that this app is deployed at two sites. So I have, this is actually a second Avi controller, and you can see I've got that DVWA West and my DVWA East deployed. And so these are two separate VIPs on two separate controllers that I'm going to load balance traffic between leveraging GSLB, okay? Now, before you can get to this point where you're configuring VIPs, I'll show you how I configure these VIPs in a sec, but before you can do any of that, you're going to have to set up a cloud connector, okay? In Avi, when you integrate with an environment, you configure what's called a cloud connector. So I have a cloud connector on both of my Avi controllers. I'll show you how to set that up. I've got one connected to US East and one connected to US West, all right? So let me show you what it looks like whenever you configure a cloud connector. So it's pretty straightforward. However, there's a few things that you got to do. You give it a name, that's easy. And it's going to want you to specify a region, right? Because Amazon has a bunch of different data centers. Those are regions. And you got to point it at a specific region. That's the scope of the AWS cloud, all right? Now, if you've set up Avi with like a vCenter, you might know that you need a service account to connect Avi into vCenter. It's pretty much exactly the same with Amazon. You have two different ways you can skin it. You can use a user access and then a secret key. So basically, this is where kind of just using a regular Amazon account with the right permissions. You could put in the key and the secret and then authenticate the Amazon API from Avi that way. What I've actually done is I've used an IAM role. So in Amazon, you can provide an IAM role to a VM. So if you create the appropriate role and you give that role to your Avi controller, you can just use this option. I don't have to put in any service accounts or anything. Amazon already has assigned the identity to my Avi controller with the appropriate permission, so it can call the Amazon API. All right. At the bottom here, I'm not doing any Route 53 integration. I'm not using any additional integrations. There's a lot of integrations into various AWS services in Avi. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm just doing basic GSLB. All right. And then in my next, I'll click next to show you in the network tab and everything. So here I've specified my VPC. This is something I created at Amazon. You can use an existing VPC or you can create a new one as you're deploying this stuff, depending on what your needs are. And I also defined an availability zone and then a subnet. So this is specifically for management. The service engines have a management NIC that connects back to the Avi controller. So that's what this is for. If you know much about Avi and Amazon, a big benefit of Avi and Amazon that we can do a multi-AZ deployment. So that way you can have service engines be available across multiple availability zones. I'm not doing that because I don't want to, but in production, you may want to do that. Management, it might not be so important, but I would still do it on management if I could. And it's very much important on your data plane because an Amazon region can go out anytime. There's no SLA to say that all regions and all availability zones in all regions are always going to be out forever. That's not how cloud works. Sometimes you will have an AZ outage, so having a multi-AZ setup is important. That's it. You can reference a template service engine group in here as well. I'm going to show you the service engine group for my Amazon setting here in just a second. You can add custom tags. You can do it. You can do some other things, but again, I've just had a very basic setup, and this is my environment. This is for the management connection. All right, so I've got that set up. Now I'm going to go over to a service engine group. I'm going to show you the service engine group for one of the clouds. And by the way, that cloud setup, if you're doing a multi-region deployment with multiple controllers, you're going to set up the exact same thing in West, leveraging that VPC, that subnet. All right. So in the service engine group, if you know much about Avi, in the service engine group in Avi, when you have a cloud and a service engine group falls underneath a specific cloud type, the service engine group is going to have different properties based on what makes sense for that cloud. So because this service engine group is under an AWS-based cloud, what you'll find is that I can do things such as determine what flavor of instance I would like to be deployed as my service engine, right? There's a lot of different instances in Amazon that you can leverage and deploy service engines on top of. So this is where you would determine the flavor of that instance, so the size of your service engine. That's related to how much packets you can process on the virtual load balancer. And this is where you would make other normal service engine configuration changes. Another important one related to Amazon is you can either, so when the service engines that are deployed, they're going to need certain security groups applied to them. In Amazon, there's security is on in your VPC, so traffic is being denied, and you have to have exceptions so that way the service engine can talk back to the components that it needs to. For example, it needs to talk back to the Avi controller. It also needs to open up ports, like if it's serving a VIP or if it's serving DNS, I need to have port 53 open or port 80 open for my VIP, right? So as I make changes to Avi, if you have these Avi managed security groups, Avi is actually going to be automatically updating the security groups as you make configuration changes to the load balancer. Those exceptions will be added into Amazon. So it's a very automated experience. This is how I've done it, and it was the easiest way to set it up. However, you don't have to do that. You could consume existing security groups as well. So if you for some reason can't do the Avi managed option and you'd like to use an existing security group and apply that to your service engines, you can do that as well. And you can see we have the option to apply both a management security group and a data NIC security group using this model. All right. So that's the cloud, the service engine group, pretty basic. So let's get into the GSLB setup. All right. So as far as the bones, the fundamentals of what you need in your Avi controllers, one of the first things you're going to have to do is at each site that you want to be responding to DNS requests. So here, I've got my two DNS service engines, right? By the way, as an aside, you could put the VIP and the DNS service on the same service engine. There's no rule against that. In fact, in my environment, that's what I've done. Wouldn't recommend that for production. It's nice to have a separate pool of capacity for DNS requests. So DNS is pretty lightweight. You usually configure, one or two small service engines to respond to that, unless you have a really high DNS requirement. But anywho, the DNS virtual service is one of the first things you got to create, and that's got to exist at both sites because when the user tries to resolve traffic, At some point when they're going to hit this delegated subdomain, in my case, the trevor.poc.demoavi.us subdomain, and they're going to have to resolve against Avi, right? Avi needs to apply some intelligence and decide, am I going to respond with my site A record or my site B, C, D record? Like, which record am I going to give back to the user? So the user's request for DNS eventually does have to hit Avi, right? So that means that in the Avi controller, you need to configure a virtual service that serves DNS, right? It kind of makes sense. You've probably, if you're watching this video, you might have configured a VIP in Avi. A DNS virtual service is a little bit different. A DNS virtual service, you don't really need a pool. You just need something that can respond to and serve A records. Let me show you how I've configured my DNS service engine, or sorry, my DNS virtual service, but know that you would need to do this at both of your sites whenever you're configuring in your environments, all right? So I'm going to pop you in here. It's pretty simple. All I've done is I've created the virtual service. I've selected the network. So I only have one subnet in my VPC, so that's the only one I have available. But you'll see a list of all the subnets that your service account can see within your given region or VPC. Okay, so I'm going to deploy my VIP to this private IP space in Amazon. I also my solution here is a public solution, so I'm actually responding to users out on the internet. Therefore, I gave this an elastic IP, which has a public IP address. You don't got to do that. You could keep it all private, or maybe you have a use case where you need GSLB for just like internal corporate users or something like that. So you don't need to have the elastic IP. That's just how I'm doing my setup. And so to configure your DNS virtual service, you get an IP, a VIP, and then you need to make the application profile system DNS, all right? Because I'm not doing a web app, right? A common thing to do is HTTP or HTTPS or SS or like a layer 4 VIP. I'm doing a DNS VIP that's going to be able to listen and respond on port 53 DNS. And I've also set this VIP up to listen on both UDP port 53, but also TCP port 53. There's a little flag up here. You can switch to advanced, and then from there you can do an override. So basically, this one DNS virtual service will respond to both TCP DNS requests, but also to UDP DNS requests. That's the only reason I set that up. Okay. That's actually all you need to configure. It's listening on DNS, okay? Later, we're going to come back and add static DNS records to this virtual service. However, for now, this is good. So you'll next finish through your wizard again, unless you have a specific like service engine group you need to configure, then you would want to set that up. I did one other small change to my environment. It's to use the VIP as SNAT. So there's a lot of health checking involved in these sort of DNS things because you need to be able to know, like, if a VIP goes down, we don't want to respond with that record, that A record anymore. We need to take that out of the pool. And so leveraging this, use VIP as SNAT, allows me to health check the public IP. So what that does is just makes it so that way my health checks work for my public use cases all. But this would be something you might need to engage, especially for those public IP-based use cases. So anyway, if you find your health checks failing, that could be why. All right, so this all looks good. So that's a proper setup DNS VIP. You would want to do that at both Avi, and then you would also want to do that at any other sites. You know, I'm doing 2 sites, maybe you have 4 sites, 6 sites, whatever. You would set this DNS responder up at each site that you want to resolve DNS records. Right. By the way, you don't have to have a DNS tier at every single site either. You could have VIPs at a site and not have DNS at that site. Like, there's a lot of ways to mix and match and a lot of ways to design this thing. Just wanted to say that part. All right. So I'm going to show you something next in Avi that a lot of users miss. Okay. I've configured my DNS virtual service, but because, owning DNS, it could be potentially impactful. It could be disruptive if done the wrong way. You do need to tell Avi and give it permission at an administrative level to start responding to requests on these service engines. So I'm going to go into administration and then system. Nope. Settings. Yeah. So in both of my controllers, I also am going to need that DNS virtual service you created. I'm telling you, everybody forgets this step. If it's not working, this might be why yours isn't working. You have to basically tell Avi, hey, use this virtual service for DNS, right? And I've already selected mine in the drop down. You could have more than one DNS virtual service. There's absolutely no rule against that. But if you don't have the DNS virtual service turned on via this DNS service flag here in Avi, it's not going to respond to records. All right, so you got to have that turned on. So let's say that you've got a DNS virtual service in both your controllers and you've configured it appropriately. You got your cloud, your AWS cloud working, your DNS virtual service, and mine has a public IP. Maybe yours is private. That's okay. There's one other step that we need to take before we can actually set up GSLB in Avi. Pretty simple step, but so at some point, you're going to have to delegate a subdomain. All right. This is one of the more confusing parts. So try to keep up here. All right. Eventually, you're going to have to delegate a subdomain. Again, I'm doing it from Route 53. You can do it from any DNS server you have. It could be AD, Route 53, Google DNS, Azure DNS. We don't care. For me, it's Route 53. So I'm going to delegate this subdomain, the trevor.poc subdomain, to Avi. Well, in order for Avi to own that subdomain, I just need to configure an NS record on Avi. So if you go to your virtual service, you can actually create DNS records. So I could create an A record. A lot of times I'll end up configuring A records and give it like a random IP so that way I can test out DNS, make sure that that it's working properly and that the virtual service is responding. But I'm not going to set up my test A record right now. What I'm going to show you is the NS record. All right. You got to get this part right. All right. So when you configure your NS record, you need to configure the FQDN as whatever the subdomain you want Avi to be authoritative for is. Again, mine is trevor.poc.demoavi.us. Make sense? Then for the NS record, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have both of my virtual services be what's held inside the NS record for this FQDN. So I've put the name, my desired name for both of these virtual services, and also the IP. Where did this IP come from? This IP came from the DNS virtual services that you just configured. So I'll show you for my second one, right? This is in my West region. If I go to my West controller, you'll see this IP address is the IP, the public IP. Again, you could use the private if you're doing a private use case. I'm doing a public use case. This is the IP address that I have pasted in here, right? And vice versa for my my DNS virtual service that I configured in the East. Okay, so I just got to put those IPs in here so that way Avi knows what the IP is that is hosting the DNS responders here for this subdomain effectively. Okay, so this is just a requirement, and without this, you'll hit an error when you start configuring GSLB. So just make sure that this part is done. Again, like most of these initial setup steps, this needs to be done on both sites. Okay, so now I've got all the kind of bones in place. My last step in Avi, there's some things I got to do in Amazon, and I want to show you all. But the last step in Avi is actually to set up GSLB, okay? What that means is I'm going to tell Avi what the GSLB subdomain I want it to be authoritative for is. I'm going to link together my East and West Avi controllers. So I'm going to kind of create a relationship between those so they can sync GSLB configurations and they can see each other's inventories and stuff like that. It'll make more sense, but just here's how it goes, all right? I'm going to configure my first GSLB site, okay? So GSLB East, you can see it's pulled IPs. These are the IPs of my controller cluster, all right? So if I were to show you the EC2 instances that this controller is running on, these are the private IPs for that. Avi knows that, and it just pulled them in already, all right? I'm going to give my username and password for this. Again, this is the user password for the Avi controller, okay? So I put that in. I've told it here what port. Again, I'm really pointing this at itself right now, so this part is a little easier. And then the subdomain, remember, it's trevor.poc.demoavi.us. Okay, so that's my subdomain. And then client group IP type. Again, I've told you a lot. I'm doing a public use case, so my clients are coming from public IP space, but you could make it so that your clients are coming from private IP space, whatever. All right. This is good for my first site. So I'm going to save it, and then I need to set the DNS virtual service. So All right, cool. Typo. So I save that, and then I'm going to reference my DNS virtual service again. And I'm also, remember that subdomain that I configured the NS record for before? Here it is. So I'm going to say, hey, here's the subdomain. You can add other DNS virtual services and other subdomains. That's totally chill. I'm just using one right now. Cool. So I've got my first GSLB site configured. All right. It's my GSLB East. I'm going to go ahead and add my West site now. Okay, so I did GSLB East. I configured that on my East controller. My East controller is going to be the kind of primary for GSLB, the leader. And now I'm talking about GSLB West. Mine's an active member. Pretty much all mine are going to be. And then so this is where, you remember before when I created the first setup, it knew the IPs of the controller? That's because I was basically creating GSLB on for the East site on my East controller. Well, now I'm on the East controller connecting it to the West controller. So I need to have the IPs of my West controller. So you'll be able to see where I get those actually. So I'm going to open another tab to the AWS console. All right, so I'm going to show you kind of where I would get these IPs in Amazon. But if you know the IPs of your controllers, you would just start plugging in your IPs here. I have 3 controllers configured in a cluster, so I'm putting each individual IP. But if you just had 1 controller for your setup or 2, then you would just put in 2. So I have controller. These are my controllers: controller 1, controller 2, and controller 3. So I just need to grab their private IPs. So I have Amazon showing my private IPs. And so I can just copy and paste them, but you might need to adjust what Amazon is listing with this little settings button here, depending on your AWS console. But anyway, here's my 3 IPs, so I'm just going to put these in. Cool. I've got my 3 IPs in here, and this is important, right? We're connecting these via the private IPs because these are both hosted in internal AWS IP space. These don't need to go over the internet. You don't want them to go over the internet. Why would you want this? Is how GSLB stays in sync across the 2 sites. We would not want that to go across the internet. There's not a good reason for that. So this will have ride the private IPs of the controllers. All right. This is good. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to save and set the DNS virtual service. Okay. Cool. So I've connected that between the 2 sites, and now I'm going to do the same deal. Select my DNS virtual service at my West site, and then say, hey, this is the subdomain that we're using. Boom. All right. So now if I go to infrastructure GSLB, you're going to see I have these 2 sites. This one is currently the leader. This other one is an active site. You can see all the IPs of the controllers in here, how they're communicating, port 443, the versions, et cetera. If they're in sync, if they're not in sync, the health of each site. If one were to go down or the connectivity were severed, you would see this health status change. So this is it. This is GSLB is now in place. Okay. The very next thing I would do would be come into GSLB services and configure a GSLB service. However, there's some steps that I'm going to take on the Amazon side here in just a second. But to just show you sans Amazon with no subdomain delegation to show you this working, remember, I have 2 virtual services, DNS01, and then I also have this virtual service, which is just a very basic VIP listening on port 80 and 443, load balancing to 2 web servers, and I have that in both sites. So if I wanted this, now that I've got all my Avi side stuff in place, if I wanted to string this service and this service together using GSLB, all I would do is go to, you see how I can have this new tab, GSLB services. I can go to that tab, and this is where I create a GSLB domain. So I'm going to do an advanced setup. So this is going to be my app name, my full app name, and that's just what I'm naming the virtual service. But I'll put global in here, and again, see this subdomain this is an option here because this is the one that I configured in that previous GSLB config. Health monitor. All right, so I'm not going to tell you what all these are, but you would want your DNS service engine to be health checking your VIPs, right? Because if the DNS virtual service engine is health checking your VIPs, you'll know if a VIP goes offline for some reason. And when that happens, the DNS service engine would stop responding with the record. that corresponds with that virtual service. So that's why health checks are important. So you can do different things with health check. I'm going to make mine HTTP because I know it's an HTTP application and it should be responding to that via the health check. Remember when I did the use VIP as SNAT earlier? This is also why I did that, so I could control where the health check was coming from. So this looks pretty good. And so all you really do when you configure a GSLB service is you set up an FQDN and then you create a pool, and the pool will reference some VIPs or IPs if you're not using Avi VIPs, but I'm using Avi VIPs. So down here, right, I have to create my 2 pool members, but you could just put an IP in. So let's say you're load balancing to something that's not on Avi, but you still want Avi to do GSLB. You could put in an IP or an FQD in here, but because my VIP is on Avi, I'm able to take advantage of the full end-to-end integration. So my pool members, it's pretty easy. I'm going to select which site. I'm going to select which virtual service. So this is where I'm going to say, hey, I want the pool member of my GSLB domain to be the East virtual service and the West virtual service. So I've configured the East virtual service. West is being configured right now. And then the only other thing I'm changing, again, I've said it a few times, my setup is using public IPs. I want the DNS record to respond with the public IP, not the private IP. So that is why I've done it this way. All right. But you have control over that. And this is it. I only have 2, but again, you could add a lot of different pool members. You can give them different weights with this ratio flag here. There's a lot of settings that we can do to customize this even further. Like, for example, I'm using round robin, but you can do site persistence, and you can do geo-based routing, topology-based routing, which basically means that you can more intelligently respond to the requests based on other variables or behavior that you want. But for me, I'm doing just round robin. All right. All right, so I've configured this. If I wait just a second, I'll even go into this so you can see. When you first configure it, it's usually red, but I always go to the events tab so that way I can see when the pools are going up or going down. You can see that these ones came up a little bit after turning it on. This is where those health checks I configured come into play. We're doing some health checks to make sure that the app is good before we make everything green and gravy and we start routing traffic to it. You can see all my stuff is up now. My main virtual service is now green, so everything's good. Again, if you want to, if these are red, check out this tab. It's probably because the health check's failing. All right, cool. I've got a GSLB VIP. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to show you how to validate that this is actually working. All right, using a very simple tool called Dig. All right, I use the crap out of Dig when I'm setting up GSLB. All right, Dig is a simple command. I can dig something, and then I can, if I just did an NS lookup directly, or I just dig something directly, it's going to use the DNS server I have set on my Mac here. So it's going to use the DNS configured for this Mac that I'm on. However, to test this, to make sure the GSLB is working, what I can do is dig, and I can do dig at, right? And I'm going to dig my DNS VIP. Because remember, now that I have that DNS service created, as soon as I configure this and this is online, what should happen is that this VIP, this DNS virtual service, should now start responding with the different A records for my apps, right? So I'm doing a dig at 44 dot, the IP that I have here that on the internet, and then the FQDN that I'm going to dig for is my app name, the global app name that I just created. Again, the reason I'm doing this is because if I just tried to hit this URL directly, if I don't have my domain delegation set up, it's not going to work. And so this is just a way to validate GSLB is actually working. I can see that my query went out. I did get an answer, that the answer that I'm getting right now is that IP. And if I keep digging over and over again, I'm going to be flipping between my 2 sites, right? This is, again, I'm one user, but imagine every one of these requests is a different user trying to connect to my app. Right now, I'm routing that user to a totally different data center using these DNS responses as a control mechanism, right? So I'll take us back to the board here. I am digging this, right? I'm digging this VIP, and it's round robin responding. Hey, first go to this site to access the web app. Hey, then go to this site to access the web app. So now I'm load balancing traffic across not just servers, but across entirely different data centers. So there's scale benefits to that. Obviously, there's availability benefits to that. And this is how you design multi-cloud stuff. So, okay. So I validated that this is working. And I've gotten the full GSLB up and configured in Avi. Walked you through how to set this up. I didn't walk you through this VIP and how I configure that, but just for you to see how I configure that VIP. Again, it's the same idea. I gave it a public IP. I configured all these various settings, and then I just said, hey, here's my pool. Listen on 80 and 443. This is a basic virtual service. Google how to set it up. You'll figure it out. It's pretty easy. Okay. This is there to reference in the GSLB config, and because you have to have something responding to your web requests, DNS without an application to resolve to at the end doesn't do us a whole lot of good. All right, so now let's look at the AWS setup. I'll talk about IAM, some networking and security stuff, and how to do the domain delegation. Also, how to just get an Avi controller up and running in Amazon. All right, so first of all, I'm not going to walk you through how to go to the Amazon Marketplace and configure an IAM role. Like this video would be even more long than it's going to be already. So just read this document, please. It's a very good document. That's all I can say. You know, I spend a lot of time looking up this document, reading the document, and then just copying and pasting answers to questions that if somebody would take the 10 minutes required to read this document, everything's going to be a lot easier for you when you deploy on Amazon. So read the document, follow the prerequisites. It goes from top to bottom. It's not going to jump around on you. Just read it and you'll have a controller deployed. If you already know about Amazon, what you need to do is just deploy an Avi controller. So in the marketplace, if I just search Avi networks, you're going to see that we have Avi controllers there available for you to go ahead and deploy. So it maybe just go ahead and deploy the controller here. Check the sizing to figure out what the instance type you need to deploy in Amazon will be. Again, that's documented, but this is how you could deploy the controller, all right? Just right through the Amazon Marketplace. All right, so that is how you deploy an Avi controller. However, there are some things that you need from a kind of prerequisite perspective. So I'm going to take to my US East 1. And this stuff is in the doc. So one of the most commonly made mistakes as people are configuring this are either ports and protocols are blocking traffic between the service engines or the VIPs and the controllers. So if you're having issues, check that. And also the identity. So specifically, we have to walk through the IAM role setup. So there's another document referenced here for how to set up the roles. I'm telling you, don't freak out. Scroll down in the document before you call me, okay? Because you're going to call me asking me, oh, I don't know about IAM. How do I set this up? See right here. This is how you do it. It walks you through step by step how to do it in both the CLI, and if you hate CLIs and you want the GUI, hey, we'll do it there for you too. So just read the document, please. I'm not an IAM expert, all right, but I know how to read a document, all right, and I think you should know how to do that too. So you got to set up the IAM role, and again, you either will assign that role to an account, or those roles to an account with the various permissions, or you'll assign those to your actual controller VMs. So I have mine assigned to my controller VMs. Let me see if I can show you that. Yeah, you see how I got my IAM role, right, attached to this controller. That's what allows me to do the integration so easily. Because whenever I have the appropriate permission configured IAM role attached and I configure my cloud, I don't have to really provide a service account or anything. The identity is already tied to the controller VM because I assigned it to the controller VM, all right? So anyway, make sure that that's good. I also configured a VPC in Amazon. You could set this on top of an existing VPC or a new VPC. The only thing I'll say is if you're new to Amazon or you're trying to figure out Amazon as you're deploying Avi on it, Some things that were helpful for me were, one, I had to set up a VPC peering between my east and west regions, so that way my controllers can communicate to one another. Since I configured a brand new VPC, I also had to configure my VPC, but I had to configure subnets within my VPC. So I configured a VPC, I configured a subnet. I also had to configure an internet gateway. Okay, and I had to attach that to my VPC, so that way I could get access in and out of the internet from this environment. And in addition to that, I also had to configure some routes. So whenever you configure a route, let me see if I can find my route table here. All right, so here's my route table. I also, again, you have to configure in Amazon by default in the brand new VPC. I have to create a default route and point it at my internet gateway to make that work. All right. So these are just some things that I had to do to get my environment working. I'm not like an Amazon expert. There's a lot of people that are way better at it than me. So I thought I'd give you these kind of basics, like getting the connectivity to your public IPs. It does take some steps. It's not just there if you're creating your first VPC. Hopefully you got an existing VPC with all the required stuff in place, but if not, you might have to tinker around with your routes. You might have to create an internet gateway, and you might have to set up a peering between regions if you're doing a multi-region deployment like me. I have a peering configured between my east and west region VPCs. Okay. That might have been confusing if you don't know a lot about cloud networking. So sorry. This part, if you need help with this part, unlike IAM, I will help you. You can call me if you have questions about the VPC networking. That's interesting. I'm not going to help anybody set up IAM rules though. Sorry. All right. So I got IAM networking security a little bit, right? So in Amazon, there's NICs, virtual NICs, like in any type of virtual system here. And those NICs, so I'm in my EC2 instance. This is an EC2 instance in Amazon. Everything looks the same in Amazon, so it might be hard for you to figure out which page amount of times I'm in an EC2 instance, and I'm inside of a specific instance. And you'll see that this instance has some IPs. I can look at all these stuff, but here's what I want to see: my ENIs. So I have a Avi management interface and I have an Avi data interface. These interfaces have different security requirements, right? So there might be different security groups applied to management that are applied to data. When I say security group, I'll go into, for example, my data security group or my data ENI. You need to be looking at the security group attached to the ENI, not just assuming that the one applied to the EC2 instance is right for the whole EC2 instance. All right. Sorry, I'm talking too much, but here's the security group. Point is, inbound rules in Amazon, you might need to create some exceptions. Avi will automate some of this for you if you choose to let it, but if you don't, then you have to do this stuff manually. Same with outbound rules. There are some things that I needed to allow. I pretty much just allow everything outbound though. Okay, so I think that's it. So now I want to show you the important part. Like these parts, I'm hoping that people watching this might have enough basic Amazon knowledge to clunk their way through deploying the controllers and deploying the service engines for their load balancing. However, the real important thing when it comes to Avi GSLB, if you're using Route 53, is going to be to do the domain delegation. All right. I talked about this a little bit earlier. This is when I go into Route 53, and Route 53 in my environment has this zone, poc.demoavi.us. So I need to create 2 A records because I have 2 sites, but if you had 3 sites, you might create 3, 4, or 5, however many A records you need. I only need 2. And then, by the way, people call these glue records. Coworker of mine, Joey, calls these glue records. Anyway, this is just how you delegate a subdomain in Route 53, and it's actually pretty similar for AD as well. AD, they'll like have a little wizard to create the NS record for you, but this idea of you need an A record for each one of the DNS virtual services, and then you need an NS record and your DNS provider pointing your subdomain at that DNS service. It might be easier if I just freaking show you and shut the hell up, right? My Route 53 has a bunch of different zones. I'm going to take us into that POC subdomain that I'm using. I'm using the public one, by the way. I need it to be public because I'm working with public users. So in my environment, I've got 3 records configured to do the domain delegation. I have this record, Trevor NS1 and Trevor NS2, right? And the IPs for these IPs might look familiar to you. these are the IPs that are the public IP of my DNS virtual service. So I have an A record pointed at each one of my virtual services that are hosting the DNS service. And then I have my NS record effectively saying, hey, Route 53, anything that has the trevor.poc.demoavi.us tag, go ahead and any requests for that, send them to these two name servers, because these two name servers know what the hell's up with that subdomain, right? To create these records, you just click create record and you create either the A record or the NS record. You create these records, and then when you create these records, what should happen is that now as I query trevor.poc.demoavi.us, Route 53 will know that these are authoritative for that. Therefore, Avi is authoritative for it. Therefore, Avi can start controlling which users get routed to which data center based on that DNS response. All right, so this domain delegation is there already in my environment. So I'll live a little dangerously here. I should be able to already hit this because I have my delegation set up. Let's see if it works. Yeah, it's already working. So I'm actually already hitting that virtual service because all of my stuff is in place here now. That's kind of it. Like if you're just trying to set it up and you didn't make any mistakes, you're following along, you might be working as well if you got those NS records and all the Amazon components and the Avi components up and running. I'll say this about this solution. This is the hardest part, getting these initial components in place. And I understand there's a number of steps to make that happen. But once it's up, the actual continued operation of it is pretty simple. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind. If you got thrown off during the setup, remember, once it's there, and you have this service across your various data centers. All right. I think what I'd like to do now is teach you a little bit about an awesome tool called Dig. And I'm going to use Dig to show you how I would troubleshoot and validate that Route 53 has delegated the subdomain correctly. I'm going to start by querying an Amazon server for this domain, and then I'm going to walk through the full DNS request to show you how you could validate that this is working. So I'm going to use Dig again. This time I'm actually going to dig an Amazon server, and I'm going to dig that full domain, poc.demoavi.us, and I'm going to say NS, right? This is a flag that's optional at the end. The @ flag is optional too, by the way, but NS, this is going to say, hey, tell me what NS records are on this DNS server for this record. Right? So what's responded here? I typed that in. You see these 4 records? These are all the name servers for that subdomain. Looky there. That's the exact same thing. So this is the expected response, right? If you're getting a different response than you would have expected, then there could be something hooked up in your DNS request. So I'm actually now going to do the same thing, except now I'm going to add this. I'm going to say, okay, cool. You knew the poc.demoavi.us and who were the name servers for that, but Mr. Super Smart Amazon name server in the United Kingdom, do you know who the NS servers are for this domain, trevor.poc.demoavi.us? Interesting. You can see I made the request, and lo and behold, actually it did respond to say, hey, these servers are authoritative. I'm going to go down. Remember, these are my are the records that this was responding with, but this is the record I was querying, and this is how I validate that I did that delegation correctly, that indeed this trevor.poc.demoavi.us, that the source of truth are my Avi name servers now, right? A final test here would be to dig with my full, I'm going to take NS off because I'm just going to dig an A record, but I'm going to dig that same server, but now I'm going to do my global URL. Again, the global URL, after I got all my Avi components in place, that's the name of the app that I configured, global, right? So I'm going to dig Amazon for this subdomain. So what I'm hoping happens is Amazon says, like, the path follows this logic where my client is querying Amazon. Amazon's going to say, well, actually, since that's a Trevor subdomain, we're going to want you to ask Avi. So then the client will say, okay, cool, I'm going to ask Avi. It's going to query one of the two DNS servers, and then what should happen is, in a round robin fashion, it should respond with either the first record or the second record. As a final step here, I'll just dig, and this is kind of like the ultimate test is that the full DNS chain is working. So I'm going to dig the full domain, and I should get a response. Yeah, you can see I've gotten a response, and that's one of my virtual service IPs. Interestingly enough, I don't know if I had analytics turned on in my environment. I don't think that I did. But what's very interesting is if you would like to log these DNS responses, you totally can. So the same way Avi's analytics help you troubleshoot an application, it can also help you troubleshoot DNS records. So just keep in mind, Dig is a great tool, but also if you want to validate the request is actually getting to Avi and you turn on all of your significant and non-significant logs, you'll see those requests come in this way also. I think that's it. I mean, I showed you a little bit about Dig. I talked to you about Amazon networking and security a little bit, very brief, but I talked that enough to hopefully get it to where you can configure the subdomain and do the GSLB. I talked to you about how the Avi setup. I'm going to close it out on a real simple one because all I need to do is add a little box to my drawing, right? Right now, there's the management plane for my setup is my Avi controller, right? If I want to configure a new application, a new GSLB app, I would go to GSLB services in my primary GSLB controller. I would click create. I would do advanced setup, and then I could keep creating services all day long with this Trevor.poc subdomain. By the way, that's why you want to delegate the subdomain, is because now you have the freedom to just make a bunch of global apps in Avi without having to have a new DNS a new DNS record created in some outside system every time. You can publish these global applications nonstop here. So the hard part is kind of setting it up. The publishing of the apps is actually pretty simple. You just keep posting API calls or going into the GUI and configuring them. Now, we love it when customers automate this stuff. That's highly recommended. However, some customers don't want to build their own automation pipelines for this sort of thing. Some customers maybe are using another management system that will automate the global publishing of services for them, right? So I do most of my work in the GUI or in the Avi API. However, if you wanted to get out of this model where the control mechanism is the Avi controller, what you could do is something like this, where there's actually two options. Option A, and I'm not going to draw this option out, but option A would be something called AMKO, right? So an AMKO, this is a Kubernetes-based solution, and in AMKO, you have a Kubernetes cluster. So like maybe this is an EKS cluster or some TKG cluster deployed in a public cloud, right? I could actually plug my Kubernetes clusters into Avi and make it so that way when a Kubernetes operator is defining their like YAML manifests, there's a little tag that they could put on their web pods to say, hey, this is a GSLB tagged pod. And by doing that and leveraging something that we call AMKO in Kubernetes and tying your cluster to Avi, but you can also have your Kubernetes environment publish these globally available FQDNs that load balance across sites. So this is, if you're trying to do multi-cloud application development, this is a way to publish a global URL that all your users can access and have that go to the various sites. And you can stack that on top of using Avi as an ingress controller to do even more site-based routing to different URLs, URIs, to do different application services and persistence down at your individual sites. So AMKO is very cool if you're trying to find a way to automate the GSLB and ingress via just the Kubernetes API. However, if you're not, maybe you are thinking a little higher level and you have adopted Kubernetes already, and you're looking for maybe a different solution that will allow us to create and automate the creation of these GSLB URLs and the access of the various services via those URLs. Another really awesome way to control and configure the GSLB services is leveraging something called Tanzu Service Mesh, TSM. So Tanzu Service Mesh now has an integration with Avi. So I can plug Tanzu Service Mesh into my Avi controllers. And by doing so, Tanzu Service Mesh has this feature called a GNS, a global namespace. When I configure my GNS, I can also specify a tag and an FQDN as I'm provisioning my GNS. And what's going to happen is any Kubernetes clusters that are controlled by the service mesh, if you create a pod and you tag the pod with the correct selector, so maybe that selector is front end, because front end is definitely a part of your app that you might want to scale across multiple clouds, or it's web or something like that, or if maybe the tag is global or something, whatever you decide to make it. But your operators can consume that tag to, again, have their pods added and managed and load balanced to. So it's a cool way to manage it, right? Because again, this management method via TSM or AMKO, either or, is a little more automated. It gives your developers the power to publish these globally available apps and do GSLB use cases and things like that without them having to route everything through some central LB admin. There's going to be environments where you decide to automate the provisioning of GSLB in Avi, and there's definitely going to be environments where customers are manually configuring GSLB services. Maybe those are environments where there's not a high rate of change and churn. However, in high change environments, very much would consider something like automating this via the APIs and SDKs and tools that are available, or leveraging, if you're a Kubernetes user especially, leveraging TSM or AMKO to automate the publishing of your GSLB services. Okay. Was this video too long? Probably. Was it confusing? Hopefully not. I hope this is helpful to somebody. I feel like I kind of was able to explain how to set this up. Again, I think there's a number of steps to get the infrastructure in place for this GSLB type of thing, because it is just a globally available thing. Like that's, it's kind of got to have a bunch of different places and footprints to scale across the globe. However, once you get this set up in place, you have it in place. You can add FQDNs, you can customize it and learn more to fulfill your various use cases. But the configuring additional services becomes pretty easy once you have these base components and the delegations and all the other requirements in place. So hope this was useful. Hope somebody learned something. I learned a lot setting this up because I'm not an Amazon user. I'm more familiar with GCP right now. So I learned a lot about Amazon, Route 53, and I also learned a lot about GSLB in general and how to troubleshoot it. Hope you did too. If you have questions about anything other than IAM, let me know. And in the meantime, happy global server load balancing, happy multi-cloud applications, happy developer, fun developer stuff. Okay. We'll see y'all. That's all I got to say. Bye.